you so much for having me and for everyone taking the time out of your day. I hear there are other exciting events happening at Royal Roads and in the community today, so I'm really humbled that you've taken the time to learn about gender equity in research and this exciting toolkit. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation. And I want to just start off by building on the land acknowledgement that Vanessa just offered to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So I'm calling from the unceded territories, colloquially known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I want to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest living on these lands. I have the incredible privilege of knowing my own genealogy. I'm in fact very interested in genealogy. It's one of my kind of pet projects and side projects. And so I know the names and dates of the arrival of my colonist and settler ancestors who arrived here uninvited. And it's such an incredible privilege to do this work and to think about gender equity in research as necessarily entangled with the process of decolonization, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in this presentation. My goals for today are to start with a bit of a personal introduction. Vanessa has just introduced me by way of my bio, but I'll tell you a little bit more about me and what I do. I'm going to introduce you to the Gender Equity in Research Toolkit by way of the table of contents. It's in draft, it's in flux, but we've got some kind of good foundations of what this tool is going to look like. We're going to talk through why gender equity and who needs it. What is this language? What does this mean? Why is this the language we're using to talk about these particular goals? And in particular, why gender equity in research? So what does gender inequity in research look like? What are we up against? What are we trying to address? As I mentioned during my land acknowledgement, I'm going to talk about the important work of decolonizing gender as part of that gender equity work. And then my goal, if time allows, is to talk through 4 examples of gender inequities and how to address them. If our time is cut a little bit brief, I might just get to 3 of these 4, but all of this content is in the toolkit. And so if we are cut a little bit short, in the interest of question and answers, you'll find this and other content in the tool. So as Vanessa said, my name is Dr. A.J. Lowick. I use they, them, their pronouns. I identify as a non-binary person, and I kind of live at the intersection of research, instruction, and consulting. So my primary hat is as a postdoctoral research fellow. My current project looks at trans people's experiences accessing or trying to access abortion care in Canada. I've done lots of other work in the reproductive and health space. I'm an instructor. I teach primarily undergraduate students at the University of British Columbia, but I've guest lectured all across Canada and the United States. And then I run a consulting business where I help all kinds of folks operationalize the values of gender equity and trans inclusion. So I work a lot in clinical spaces where healthcare providers want to better serve trans people and maybe aren't sure how to do that. And so I come in and talk through what that actually looks like. I've worked with yoga studios and film and television networks and law firms and pelvic floor physiotherapists, all kinds of different folks who are really interested in doing trans work. And then I'm also, in my kind of research role, really interested in methodologies, the way that we do research, how we measure things, what research design looks like. And that's what really brought me to the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity's Research Equity Toolkit series that Vanessa mentioned. We're just preparing to launch our 5th tool, and it really is a deep dive into some of the questions that this tool introduces you to. And so if you find yourself wanting more after being introduced to this important introductory foundation as presented by the Royal Roads tool, I do invite you to go check out the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity Toolkits for more. So this tool that I've developed, this is the table of contents in draft, subject to slight refinements and changes. But you'll see that it starts with a couple of framing sections, background and purpose, a bunch of foundational definitions, because oftentimes folks working in the gender equity space will use big words like cisnormativity, words that I'm going to use and define in today's presentation. So the tool does some of that work so that we all have kind of equal footing and are familiar with some of the language that's used in this area. And then there's 2 major content sections here. The first on conducting research with some subsections, and the second on research design with some subsections. that section on decolonizing gender that we're going to go over in today's presentation, a conclusion, and then some additional works cited and readings for folks who are looking for a bit more. And these arrows here are showing you the bits that we're hopefully going to have time to go over today, and you can see how they kind of fit in the overall structure of this tool. So the first question is, what is gender equity or gender inequity? This might be incredibly familiar to you, but inequities are these things that result from the unjust and unequal distribution of resources, rewards, and opportunities between different groups. And often when we think about gender equity or gender inequities, the discussion is related solely to cisgender men and women. We can see examples of this internationally, nationally, and locally and provincially, where you'll find something that is discussing gender equity, and it will use the language of men, women, men, women, men, women, all the way through. Important and vital that we think about cisgender men and women when we do this work, but also because of sexism, misogyny, cisnormativity, which I will define shortly, transphobia, and other systemic oppression. It's actually not just cis women who experience gender inequities. There's also trans people of all genders, non-binary people, among others, who experience gender-based inequities and who therefore are kind of caught up in this work. I have a second cat who's trying to join me, so we'll just see if he wants to settle or if he's upset that I'm talking. So throughout this presentation, and indeed throughout the tool itself, I use the language of people of marginalized genders. This is used to refer to all people who are marginalized, minoritized, subordinated, or otherwise disadvantaged, thus experiencing gender-based inequities based on their gender identities, modalities, or expressions. This is helpful language because it allows us to reflect on the systems of power that render certain people marginalized, that this marginalization, these gender inequities, are not by kind of nature of how one identifies, but the result of systemic oppression and power. This term is also really helpful because it makes space for the evolution of language. On my previous slide, I explicitly named cisgender women, trans people of all genders, non-binary people, among others, as folks who experience gender-based inequities. People of marginalized genders, without naming them, names and invites in all of those people and makes space for shifts and changes for how we understand gender identities. There might be words not yet developed. And so instead of constantly changing the list, we can use this language of people of marginalized genders in a way that we hope is a little bit more resistant to the changes of time, because there will always be people of marginalized genders in a system and society that is built on sexism, misogyny, and other gender-based oppression. So how do we achieve gender equity then? If we're thinking about this unequal and unjust distribution of resources, rewards, and opportunities, how do we fix that? What does gender equity work look like? The first thing is that gender equity work involves treating people of different genders fairly. And that fairly word is really important here because that means according to their respective needs. So instead of equally dividing a piece of pie, we might actually give someone more pie because we're doing so to acknowledge and address historical and ongoing social disadvantages. We're trying to repair harms done by those systemic inequities. And so we're treating people of different genders fairly. We're also trying to remove barriers that stop people of marginalized genders from reaching their full potential. This involves ensuring that all people, regardless of gender, can actively and meaningfully participate in all aspects of life, including as researchers and as research participants, among other things, without being discriminated against, stereotyped, or devalued. There's also an important concept here called mainstreaming. And so part of gender equity work involves mainstreaming gender. You might be thinking to yourself, well, gender is actually pretty tangential to my research, or not at all caught up in my research. Gender is not on my radar. And mainstreaming asks us to take something which we had understood or seen as marginal and peripheral and bringing it to the core of what we do, that actually gender matters. And can we think about the ways that gender matters, where doing so helps us address those gender-based inequities? In research, this gender equity work matters and happens for two interconnected reasons. The first of which is who is doing the research. And as Vanessa said at the top of the session, this is also about like processes and teams. This is an employment equity issue, among other things. This is about ensuring that our research teams are diverse in terms of their composition, that folks have access to job acquisition and opportunities for advancement. So gender equity is about employment equity. But it's also linked to the quality of research, where each of us as researchers, regardless of our role, are bringing our biases, attitudes, values, and perspectives into the research process, even if we come from a research paradigm that kind of claims objectivity, that claims that the researcher is not involved in the research, but simply observes. That's actually not necessarily true, and each of us are bringing those biases, attitudes, values, and perspectives into what we do. And so who is doing research matters for gender equity. The other interconnected reason here is what research is being done and how it's being done. So gender equity is integral to our research design, data collection, analyses, and reporting processes to ensure that the research itself is reliable, accurate, precise, generalizable, inclusive, these kinds of words that we can borrow from different research disciplines to essentially say good quality, that the research is sound, that the research is robust. Gender equity matters there too. Let's look at each of these in turn to see some examples. So the first, who is doing research? When we think about cisgender women, we see significant barriers to career advancement. We see cisgender women are unpaid as compared to cisgender men. They hold lower positions, fewer senior leadership and PI positions, less likely to be authors of published papers, published in less prestigious journals, and cited less frequently. And this is especially pronounced in certain fields and is exacerbated by other inequities. So we see cisgender women of color, disabled cisgender women, etc., experiencing the kind of root of these inequities. And this is all supported by the evidence. This is not simply me stating this. This is something that we know to be true and has been found time and time again. And there's citations to support these claims in the tool itself. And then if we look at trans folks of all genders, actually our evidence is less robust because trans people are kind of erased from the research about who's doing research. But we nevertheless know that trans folks experience significant barriers of entry into research careers, that trans folks are systematically disadvantaged when it comes to educational attainment, are cut out of post-secondary education opportunities, experience violence and discrimination as students, and thus are less likely to achieve jobs in research settings and then to advance in those jobs. We also see a kind of hyper-visibility, invisibility paradigm for trans people in research, where on the one hand, trans people are often hired because they are trans and thus are hyper-visible in their transness as the kind of defining feature of their identity, and yet are also invisible. And so trans folks are perhaps sometimes strategically allowing themselves to go unnoticed because visibility comes with associated risks and harms. Trans folks also experience some unique challenges in publishing. A lot of us are dead named, which means a former name is used in past publications, and there's really no way to change that. You can't go back and ask a journal to change your name on a publication that was made 2, 5, 10 years ago. And we also see trans people being misgendered when cited. So even a publication today that I might release that is accurate of my name today, when someone cites me, they might use the incorrect pronouns for me, for example. And as with cis women, this is exacerbated by other inequities. So trans folks of color, disabled trans people, etc., are even more invisible, are even more disadvantaged in the process of thinking about who is doing research. And then what about that second piece, that what research is being done and how is it being done? In the tool, I look specifically at the example of clinical trials, but we could look at a myriad of other examples of what research is being done and how. Here, I want to call attention to the fact that cis women of, quote, childbearing potential were explicitly excluded from clinical trials in the United States until 1993, meaning that we have huge gaps in our understanding about how drugs work in assigned female bodies. It was something that was deemed kind of too complicated for the clinical trial landscape, and thus cis women were systematically excluded. We see clinical trials as often requiring people to identify in really reductive cisnormative ways, where female/woman or male/man is used as kind of eligibility criteria, and where the sex and genders of participants are then reported in those reductive ways. So even if there are trans people in a clinical trial sample, we don't know they're there. They're not explicitly named. We're not kind of sure how many cis versus trans people were involved in a particular study. And this is but one example. Generally, one of the things we see is profound misuse of sex and gender concepts in research, in all research types, in all fields. This is resulting from a number of kind of dominant ideologies, of ways of seeing the world that most of us have been taught and don't yet have the capacity to see beyond. They're so pervasive to the point of being invisible until someone points them out to you. The first of those is called endosex normativity, and endosex is offered as an alternative to intersex, where you might know the word intersex is referring to someone whose sex development kind of exceeds what we might see as typical development. So endosex is the antonym to that, and it is the process by which we treat sex as a simple, immutable binary, where all people are male or female, and where that is thought to tell us something really important about them and something unchanging about them. And research does this a lot. We see a lot of research that uses male and female as variables in ways that don't attend to the complexity of sex. And if you were in my Intro to Trans Studies class, we would spend 2 weeks just on this idea and this concept and kind of teasing apart what sex is and what sex isn't. The other ideology that makes us misuse sex and gender concepts is cisnormativity, a word I've used a few times in this presentation already. And this is the treatment of gender as a simple binary, where we think of all people as being either men or women. And we see this again in the way gender equity itself is often framed as a women about the subordination of women as compared to men. And that's the end of the discussion, without an acknowledgement that gender is actually multiple, plural, and dynamic universally, that the gender binary is actually not true for a lot of people. And taken together, cisnormativity and endosex normativity result in researchers treating binary sex and binary gender as though they are always going to align in particular ways. So the words female and woman are used interchangeably. The words male and man are used interchangeably. And indeed, the words sex and gender are used interchangeably. I don't know about you, but I've read lots of studies that will say the genders of my participants were male and female. Well, male and female are not genders. And so we're here misusing and misconstruing sex and gender concepts and variables, which has profound impacts not just on people of marginalized genders, but on the quality of our research. This is a mismeasurement issue. I want to pause here to talk about the importance of decolonizing gender as part of this gender equity work. So part of the work of addressing these gender-based inequities involves recognizing that gender oppression has been an important and integral part of historical and ongoing colonial violence. So this requires us to think about the way that gender has been at the center of violence against Indigenous people, that we've inherited ideologies like endosex and cisnormativity, and these have been imposed as part of colonial processes, that there's been an attempt to erase Indigenous ways of knowing and being when it comes to sex, gender, and sexuality, as well as the fact that white supremacy is an ongoing feature of research. I'd like to introduce you to an Argentinian feminist philosopher whose name is Maria Lugones, who gifted us this incredible concept of the coloniality of gender. And essentially what Lugones does in her work is remind us that colonization in Argentina, here on Turtle Island and elsewhere, has always been about racial superiority and about spreading particular ideals and ideas about gender, sex, and sexuality. What colonists brought with them when they arrived on these lands was understandings of the sex binary, of monogamy, of heterosexuality, of patriarchy, that were necessarily entangled with white Christian values and that were imposed upon Indigenous people as part of colonization. We could look at, for example, the Indian Act as codifying and legalizing both race and gender-based oppression. And this brings me to the concept of two-spirit, which often is discussed in contexts of gender. This was a term that was created in the 90s in Winnipeg by a group of Indigenous folks as a modern pan-Indigenous umbrella term that's meant to capture Indigenous people's specific conceptualization of a kind of complex mix of gender and sexuality and identity and community role as very distinct from Western concepts. It's in fact challenging to articulate what two-spirit is using the English language, because it behooves me to use words like gender identity, which actually doesn't always map neatly onto Indigenous understandings of things. Two-spirit is sometimes, but not always, a gender identity. As such, two-spirit people do experience inequities based on gender, but always in ways that are connected to anti-indigeneity, to white supremacy, and to heteronormativity. And so the invitation here is to remember two-spirit people and indeed Indigenous people of all genders in our gender equity work, and to think about how we use two-spirit in our research. Are we thinking of it as just another gender identity to be used alongside man, woman, and non-binary? That would likely be a misuse of this concept because there's nuances to it that would be lost if we did so. So taking all of that together, the goals then of this research equity toolkit that was developed for Royal Roads University is to, one, provide researchers with concrete examples of how to address inequities based on gender in research by considering how research is conducted and by whom, and to provide research with concrete examples of why gender matters in how research is conducted. I'd like to turn now to those 4 examples with the hope that I have enough time to get through all 4, but we'll see how far we get in the interest of time. The first has to do with research team composition. And I have already alluded to the fact that research team composition and indeed diversity of gender being represented in research teams is an employment equity issue, and it certainly is. We actually know from the evidence that research teams that are diverse in terms of gender drive discovery and innovation, produce papers that are more original and more highly cited, ask more diverse, varied, and novel research questions, and recruit more diverse research participants. So it actually benefits to ensure that our research teams are comprised of people of different genders, not just as an employment equity issue, but to ensure the quality, validity, and robustness of our research. Finally, I draw attention here to the adage of nothing about us without us, which was originally coined by disability justice activists and has since been used widely in Indigenous research settings to remind us that people with lived and living experience ought to be involved, including specifically in positions of power and authority, not peripherally and only on advisory committees, for example, in research that pertains to them. That it behooves us to ensure that people who are caught up in our research are involved in our research. So the research equity tool then offers some questions for reflection that researchers can be asking themselves about their research teams, offering not necessarily solutions, but opportunities to think about the importance of gender equity in research team composition. So first, you might quite plainly ask yourself, who are the members of my research team? Who's represented and who's missing? And then beyond that, are the people of marginalized genders privileged in some other way? Are there only white, straight, non-disabled, cisgender women, trans people, non-binary folks on your team? Because we have to think intersectionally here as well. We're focusing on gender, but we also need to be simultaneously addressing other inequities in research team composition. Beyond who's there and who isn't, what positions are being held here? Are people of marginalized genders in positions that involve decision-making and leadership? Are they represented among senior members of teams? Do they have access to mentors and professional development opportunities and other resources that would ensure a career advancement? Who is in charge and who is involved in research in more kind of precarious and peripheral ways? How are people of marginalized genders being compensated for their time? And this can involve financial compensation. Certainly, we know that cisgender women and trans folks are underpaid as compared to cis men, but also other kind of important compensation structures. If we're thinking about career advancement, who's named on journal articles and publications? In what order are those names appearing? Are we thinking about the importance of first authorship positions for people of marginalized genders so that they can advance in their careers, where that actually serves an important role in academia? Are we thinking about who's leading presentations and conferences, at conferences rather, and with stakeholders? In addition, why were those people of marginalized genders hired? Was it because they identify in a particular way? Are we at risk of potentially tokenizing a person of marginalized gender because we wanted to have a trans person on the team, so we were able to check that equity box, because we wanted to have a trans perspective? Are people of marginalized genders empowered to share and build research skills beyond their important and valuable lived experience? Do we only want to hear from the trans person when they have something trans to say? Or are we also invested in hearing them critique our research design or do a robust analysis of our data or bring their statistical skills to the table? And if someone who's marginalized based on gender is on your research team, what happens if they feel undervalued? Are their concerns dismissed? How do senior team members respond if someone says, hey, I'm feeling a little bit disadvantaged or disenfranchised or kind of otherwise marginalized further based on something that's happening in this setting? And then an important piece here about transparency, that we ought to be recording in our research outputs who the researchers are, how they identify, who's missing, and how those positionalities impact the research. And this is important because those details allow folks to know what potential implicit or explicit values, biases, and perspectives were brought to the research process. If a research project, for example, explores conflict resolution strategies among leaders working in social service organizations, knowing who is involved in collecting and analyzing the data is important for ensuring that the leaders being researched are diverse in terms of gender identity, and that the analysis is informed by the perspectives and opinions of people who are similarly diverse. So that's the research team composition bit. What about funding considerations? We know for certain, with lots of evidence, that gender inequities exist in funding. These happen in two ways. The first is whose research is funded. We know that there's a gender bias in how grant applications are assessed. We know that applications that look at the kind of quality of the researcher as some kind of variable are more likely to highly appraise the quality of a researcher who's read or codified or otherwise identifiable as a cisgender man as compared to people of marginalized genders. We also know that people who use gender-neutral pronouns, like they, them pronouns, are routinely discriminated against in these processes. There's a false perception by reviewers that people who use these pronouns are less qualified. There's a kind of ageism quality here. We assume that only younger people use they, them pronouns, and so they couldn't possibly have the qualifications to do this work, or that people who use they, them pronouns are troublemakers, that we will create drama in a research setting, that we will politicize our identities in a way that stirs up discord. And there's kind of this like bias against people who use they, them pronouns that we see in kind of job application and acquisition spaces, but also in research funding. So a huge gender bias in whose research is funded. It is predominantly cisgender men whose research is getting those big awards. And there's also a gender bias in what research is funded. So this is acknowledging the fact that if research is framed in a way that it is about or for cisgender women, in healthcare, this is quite rampant, that it will receive less funds than in research that is codified or written as being about cisgender men. So research connected to reproductive health for people who have ovaries, if you're studying perinatal health, or if you're studying menstruation or abortion or any of these topics, you are less likely to get funds and fewer funds than if you were studying a health-related issue that primarily, if not exclusively, is experienced by people who were born with penises, by male-assigned people, by cisgender men. We also know that research that is for or about LGBTQ people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and trans, including trans-specific research, is less likely to receive funding than projects that are focused on heterosexual people. And again, this example comes to us from the health space, but we can see lots of examples here where what research is funded is exemplary of a gender bias, where there's a privileging of research that is seen as being for or about or by cisgender men. So again, here there's some questions that we can be asking ourselves, both from that kind of employment equity, career advancement piece, and thinking about the research itself. So who is being named on a grant application? How are people of marginalized genders represented on that application? Who is taking on what role? Who is the PI? Who is the knowledge user? Who is the co-investigator? Lots of different words are used here in a lot of different grant application processes, but we should really be thinking about who is involved in this process, and are we unnecessarily continuing to give positions of power and authority to cisgender men in ways that might inadvertently disadvantage people of marginalized genders on our teams? Are there ways that we can share power when it comes to applying for grants? How have you worked compensation for people of marginalized genders into your budget? If you're doing a community advisory process, or you're going to be engaging knowledge users, or you want folks who are caught up in your research to be involved in some way in a kind of community action process, how are you paying them? How have you worked that into your budget? Is it a one-time unsubstantial honorarium, or is there actually salary associated with that ongoing work and expertise? Is this about salary support and top up for certain members of your team? Are you compensating people equitably or equally? And sometimes we have no control over this. Our budgets are set by our funders or by our institutions, and they tell us exactly how much we can pay undergraduates for their, advisory and support work on a project. But we ought to nevertheless be kind of critically investigating this funding and compensation piece. Who is getting the bulk of the money when we receive these funds? If we have community partners, organizations that are helping us with our projects, who are providing us access to participants, who are also providing expertise and insight into a topic, how are we compensating them for their time and expertise? If you're ever in the position of reviewing a grant application, and many of us find ourselves in that role when we're tasked with reviewing grant applications, can you identify any biases in your own appraisal of applications? We all bring biases with us to the work that we do. So can you think about potential biases that you might have when you're evaluating the quality of researchers? Are you negatively evaluating researcher CVs if they have educational or employment gaps that are probably explained by parental responsibilities? Are we looking at those as somehow a negative, as something that makes that candidate less ideal as compared to someone who likely did not have those parenting responsibilities? Are you more critical of applications if the researcher uses gender neutral pronouns as compared to she, her, or he, him pronouns? Recognize there's a typo there on my slide. Does the way that you've even introduced your research project in this granting and funding process reify cisnormativity? Is the way that you're describing your project a way that erases intersex, trans, non-binary, or two-spirit people, or misuses sex and gender concepts? Can we ensure that the work we're proposing to do and requesting funds for doesn't reinforce these kind of gender inequities and misunderstandings of what sex and gender are as important variables to what we do? So that's the funding piece, some of which is within our control and some of which is not, but nevertheless important questions to be asked about how we can decrease the amount of gender bias that happens in applications and be in control of the aspects of those applications that actually are within our purview. Beyond the kind of conducting research, what about the research itself, the project that you plan to do? How do you determine the relevance of gender to that project? And the first overarching thing that I will say is that no matter the topic of your research, gender matters. That it matters in ways that maybe don't appear to you at first blush, but that gender matters to research regardless of topic, field, discipline. Gender might matter only insofar as you need to accurately describe and use the correct honorifics and pronouns for the people on your team, for the people you consulted with, for the people who participated in your research. You might therefore need to ensure that you are asking everybody involved how they identify, how they'd like to be referred to in publications, reports, presentations, to ensure that that work is being done in a way that reflects the genders of everyone who is involved, all of the moving parts. That could be the person who designed your infographic. You want to credit them, you want to give a presentation and say, thanks a lot to so-and-so for her incredible work, their incredible work, his incredible work. We want to make sure we're using the right words when referring to all of these people. So if only in that way, gender matters to all research topics, regardless of what you're studying. But beyond referring to everyone appropriately and accurately, you might need to determine whether and to what extent gender matters for your research study itself, for the topic or phenomena or issue or thing that you're trying to study. And determining the relevance of gender in that case starts with research. And this can be as simple as popping into Google, including what it is that you're interested in, adding the word gender, and seeing what comes up. And there might be things that surprise you, things that you hadn't considered, gender-related factors or issues or barriers or challenges or implications for your work that you could incorporate into your project. And so really it begins at that kind of research phase of trying to see if you can find the relevance of gender. Part of this is that mainstreaming process that I described at the top of the lecture. There might be unintended or unexplored gendered consequences of your work, regardless of what you're studying. The second thing is then to choose the correct aspect of gender to measure. And I go into this really briefly in the tool, but actually the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity toolkits really dive into this in like multi-page, really nuanced ways. But for now, it's important to make sure that you're looking at the most appropriate, precise part of gender. So this concept of gender can refer to identity, how I identify, man, woman, non-binary, something else, how I express my gender, masculinity, femininity, androgyny. It can refer to gender modality, that is whether someone is cisgender or transgender. It can refer to norms or stereotypes, social roles. Gender is actually really multifaceted. And so the first step is, which bit of gender matters? Do I need to know something about the gender identities of people? Or actually, is gender expression really what I'm after? Is that the thing that I think is impacting this issue or phenomenon? So as an example, if you're interested in climate justice, you might be interested in how people of different genders, including people of marginalized genders, are disproportionately impacted by climate crises. So in this case, gender identity might be the most appropriate thing for you to measure or ask about or consider in your project. If instead you're interested in professional coaching, for example, you might want to explore how clients react and respond to different coaches. And in this case, maybe gender identity, both how coaches and clients identify, and gender expression, whether coaches are expressing their genders in masculine, feminine, androgynous, gender conforming, or gender non-conforming ways matters. In this case, it might be appropriate to measure, look at, explore both the role of gender identity and gender expression in your project. Oftentimes, we find that researchers choose gender identity as a proxy for other things, where actually just because someone is a woman doesn't mean they're feminine. And if femininity is what you're interested in, then femininity and expression is what you need to measure. And so we need to kind of untangle the bits of gender and really think critically about which bit of gender is caught up in our research project or issue. And then we need to measure that aspect of gender appropriately. There's lots of different ways to measure identity, expression, modality, norms, stereotypes, roles. The process of choosing the most appropriate way will depend on a variety of factors. There's no gold standard here. There's pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, harms and benefits of all the different approaches. And so you'll need to think about those, and you'll need to pick the survey instrument measure, the interview question, the kind of collection strategy that makes the most sense for your research project and the aspect of gender that you're trying to measure. And then, of course, we need to recruit a variety of people, because if we are interested in the kind of variety of gendered experience when it comes to identity, we need to ensure that people with diverse gender identities are included in our project. The tool goes on to provide a variety of questions. I won't enumerate them now in the interest of time, but the tool really goes into detail here about like how you should be doing this, what you ought to be asking yourself when determining the relevance of gender for your project. The concluding kind of statement here of the tool end of this presentation is that gender equity in research matters. And this is your gentle invitation to consider the ways that your research can contribute to the advancement of gender equity in terms of who's conducting the research, what research is being conducted, and how it's being conducted. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm really excited to hear your questions and comments and even research conundrums that you're trying to work through in this space. I'll stop the share now, and I'm really excited to hear from you all.